Someone sent me a message last week that I haven't been able to shake. She wrote, "Maybe I'm not actually an empath. Maybe I'm just codependent and I've been calling it empathy so I don't have to look at myself." I read that sentence probably 6 times. And then I sat with my coffee going cold and thought about my own marriage, and I realized I had never once asked myself that question about myself. Not once. In 12 years of doing this work, I want to tell you what I found when I finally did ask it, because it's not what I expected, and it's not what you're going to expect either. And fair warning, some of this is going to feel like I'm describing your exact life. That's not a coincidence. That's the whole point. Here's the question underneath her question, the one that actually matters. Why do so many of us keep choosing the same kind of person? Not literally the same person, but the same shape of person. Intense at first, then slowly, quietly, devastating. Someone told me once, I keep coming back to this, it's like I'm cursed. 3 relationships, 3 different men, same pattern down to the timeline. And she wasn't being dramatic, she was describing something real, something with an actual mechanism behind it, and almost nobody ever explains what that mechanism is. I spent 12 years in hospice care before I found Jung. I sat with people while they died, and more than once, in those last honest hours, someone would tell me about a marriage or a series of marriages that all went the same way. Not because they were unlucky, they'd say it themselves right at the end when there was nothing left to protect. I kept choosing the same wound. I didn't understand what they meant back then. I do now, and it took my own divorce, and 2 years of reading a dead Swiss psychiatrist obsessively at 2 a.m. to actually understand it. There was a man I sat with. I won't use his name obviously, but I think about him more than almost anyone else from those years. He was maybe 70, dying of pancreatic cancer, and his 3rd wife was in the hallway on the phone with her sister, instead of in the room with him. He looked at the door for a long time, and then he said, without much emotion left to spare on it, "I married my mother 3 times, different faces, same woman." I asked him what he meant, because at the time I genuinely didn't understand, and he just said, "You'll figure it out eventually." Everybody does, usually too late to use it. I didn't figure it out for another 6 years. I needed my own marriage to end first. That's the thing about this kind of knowledge. It rarely arrives before you need it. It arrives right after, when it's most painful and least useful, and you spend the rest of your life trying to get ahead of it just once. So, let me tell you where I'm going to take you today. We're going to talk about why the psyche, not fate, not bad luck, not poor judgment, chooses partners who force us to confront the parts of ourselves we've spent a lifetime refusing to look at. And I need to say this clearly before we go any further, because this is where people usually get it wrong in both directions. This is not, you deserved what happened to you. It is absolutely not that. And it's also not, you have no responsibility in this at all. You're a pure victim of circumstance. Neither of those is true. Something else is true, and it's more uncomfortable than both of those easy answers, and also, I think, more freeing. Before I go further, if this is the kind of thing that keeps you up at night the way it keeps me up, hit subscribe. Not because I need the number, because I have a lot more of these, and the algorithm only shows you more of this if you tell it to. That's really all it is. Okay, let's start with where I was wrong. For years, I believed what most people believe, that we choose partners badly because of poor judgment or low self-esteem, or just genuinely bad luck in a crowded dating pool. I believed that the solution was pattern recognition. Learn the red flags. Get better at spotting a narcissist early. Raise your standards. I taught this informally to grieving people who asked me about their families. I believed it because it felt true, and because it put the problem somewhere manageable, out there, in the world, in other people's character. And there's a version of this that's popular right now, everywhere, all over the internet. Empaths attract narcissists because narcissists can sense a soft target. Empaths are wired to see the best in people, to heal what's broken. And so we walk right into the trap because fixing someone else feels like our purpose. I've heard this 100 times. I used to say some version of it myself. It's not wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in a way that keeps people stuck because it still frames the empath as a passive good person who unfortunately keeps getting targeted by bad actors. Victim of a hunter. Nothing more to examine. Here's what started to unravel that for me. I found a piece Jung wrote in 1925 called Marriage as a Psychological Relationship, and in it, he says something that stopped me cold. He argues that partner choice isn't primarily a conscious decision at all. It's driven by unconscious projection. We take the parts of ourselves we've repressed, what he called the shadow, and we take an inner image of the opposite sex we're not even aware we're carrying, and we cast both of those onto another human being. Not metaphorically, actually. We fall in love, Jung says, with a projection, and what happens next isn't really a relationship yet. He calls it a primitive identity. We experience the other person as an extension of our own unconscious material, not as a separate person at all. I need to be honest with you. When I first read that, I got angry. A strange kind of angry that didn't go away even after I understood the words, because it meant my divorce wasn't simply a story about a woman who changed or a marriage that ran its course. It meant I had participated in constructing something long before either of us said a word to each other. Let me back up because I think this is where it gets interesting and where it stops being abstract. Jung says every one of us carries a shadow. The traits, the impulses, the needs we learned early on were not acceptable. Not evil necessarily, just unacceptable to the people who raised us, or to the version of ourselves we were trying to be. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was need. Maybe it was the desire to be taken care of instead of always being the one doing the caretaking. Whatever got exiled from consciousness doesn't disappear. It goes underground. And Jung's claim, the one that took me the longest to actually sit with, is that we don't just carry that exiled material passively, we look for it. Unconsciously, we are drawn to people who carry it for us, who express it so we don't have to. Someone wrote to me, wrote to the channel, but I'm going to talk about it like she wrote to me because that's how it felt, that she grew up managing her mother's emotions. Every mood in the house depended on how well she performed calm, performed helpful, performed fine. And she said, and this is close to word for word, "Now I realize every man I've been with needed the same thing from me." I thought that was love. It wasn't love. It was just familiar. Sit with that phrase for a second. It wasn't love. It was just familiar. That's not weakness. That's not poor judgment. That is the nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do, reaching for the shape it already knows, because the known, even when the known is painful, feels safer to the body than the unknown, even when the unknown might be good for you. I've felt this myself. After my divorce, in the middle of what I can only call actual grief, I noticed something about the women I found myself drawn to. All of them, without exception, needed rescuing in some form. And I told myself that was compassion, that I was simply a caring person who noticed pain in others. It took me an embarrassingly long time, embarrassingly long, to admit that being needed that specific way was the only kind of intimacy I actually trusted. Being wanted for no reason terrified me. Being needed felt like safety. That's not a flattering thing to say out loud. But it's true, and Jung would say it's not a moral failure. It's a mechanism, and mechanisms can be understood. Moral failures can only be punished. Now, I want to bring in someone whose work changed how I see all of this even further. Adolf Guggenbühl-Craig, who led the International Association for Analytical Psychology for years, wrote a book in 1977 with a title that startled me the first time I saw it, Marriage, Dead or Alive. And his central claim is almost aggressive in how it cuts against everything our culture tells us about relationships. He says marriage, and I'd extend this to any serious romantic bond, does not exist to make you happy. That's not its function. Its function is to be what he calls a crucible for individuation, a container hot enough, pressurized enough to force the parts of you that you've hidden from yourself into the light. I remember reading that on my porch and just staring at the mountains for a long time afterward. Because if that's true, if the friction, the conflict, the maddening incompatibility in a relationship isn't a sign that something's broken, but is actually doing exactly what it's supposed to do, then every relationship I'd ever blown up in frustration, looking for the right person who wouldn't cause friction, was me running from the one thing that might have actually helped me. I wanted ease. Guggenbühl-Craig is telling me ease was never the point. But, and I want to be careful here because I don't want you to hear something I'm not saying, this is not an argument for staying in something abusive because it's good for your growth. That's a dangerous misreading, and I want to kill it before it takes root. Guggenbühl-Craig is describing psychological friction, the discomfort of confronting your own shadow through a partner who reflects it. He is not describing violence. He is not describing a pattern that endangers you. Those are different categories, and Jungian thought does not romanticize suffering for its own sake. What he's describing is the ordinary, uncomfortable, necessary friction that any real intimacy generates once the honeymoon phase ends and two actual unconscious minds start colliding. So here's the question that was sitting underneath all of this for me, and maybe it's sitting underneath this for you too. If the friction is the point, if the partner is somehow reflecting my own shadow back to me, how does that actually work? Not philosophically, mechanically. What is actually happening between two people? This is where I have to bring in something stranger, and honestly, something I resisted for a long time because it sounded too mystical even for me. Jung, in a text called The Psychology of the Transference, published in 1946, uses this old alchemical image, the Rosarium Philosophorum, a set of woodcuts alchemists used centuries ago to describe the transformation of base metal into gold. And Jung says this image is actually describing something psychological. He calls it the conjunctio, the alchemical marriage. Two substances, think of them as two unconscious contents, are placed together in a vessel. And under heat and pressure, they combine, they dissolve into each other, and eventually something new is produced that neither substance was on its own. Jung's claim is that this is a precise map of what happens in an intimate relationship. Two people project their unconscious material onto each other. That's the joining, the conjunctio at the start, the intensity you feel when it seems like this person just gets you on some level words can't reach. That intensity isn't imaginary. It's real. It's just not at first about the other person specifically. It's your own repressed material recognizing its reflection. And here's the part that actually matters, the part that took me the longest to metabolize. Jung says projection is not a mistake to be avoided, it's a necessary stage. You cannot skip it. The transformation, the actual gold, if we're staying with the metaphor, only happens later when the projections start to withdraw. When you begin to see the actual person in front of you instead of the image of your own unconscious material, you paint it onto them. That withdrawal is agonizing. It can feel like falling out of love, even like grief, even though what's really happening is that you're finally seeing clearly for the first time. I think that's exactly what was happening in my own marriage in the last year before it ended, and I didn't have language for it then. I remember the specific moment the projection cracked. We were in the kitchen, nothing dramatic was happening, we were just doing dishes, and I looked at her, and for just a second I saw a person who was tired and scared and trying her best, instead of the version of her I'd built in my head, the one who was supposed to fix the parts of me I couldn't fix myself. That second terrified me more than any fight we'd ever had, because it meant the person I'd fallen in love with, in some sense, had never fully existed. I'd fallen in love with my own reflection wearing her face. I almost stopped researching this whole topic right there, honestly. It felt like too much to hold. There's a particular kind of tired that comes from realizing a belief you've built your identity around might not survive contact with the truth. And for about a week, I just avoided opening any of Jung's books at all. I told myself I was busy. I wasn't busy. I was scared of what came next. I want to be specific about what that week actually looked like, because I think I took a break undersells it. The books sat on the counter where I always leave them, and I walked past them every morning to make coffee, and every morning I felt a small flicker of something like guilt, and I ignored it. I went on 2 walks in the Blue Ridge Mountains that week, longer than I usually take, the kind of a walk where you're not really looking at the trees, you're just trying to outpace a thought. It didn't work, obviously. Thoughts don't have legs, but they don't need them. They're already wherever you are. On the 5th day, I sat in my car outside the grocery store for probably 20 minutes without going in, just turning the kitchen memory over again, the dishes, the look on her face, the second I saw her as a person instead of a fix for me. I remember thinking, clearly, almost out loud, if I keep pulling this thread, I don't know what's left of the story I've told myself about my own marriage. And for a week, that felt like a good enough reason to stop pulling. It wasn't, but it felt that way. But then I found the piece that made all of this click into something coherent, something that finally answered the question I actually started with. Why do people keep choosing the same pattern over and over, even after therapy, even after they know better? In Ion, published in 1951, Jung lays out something he calls the marriage quaternio. And the idea is this. In any committed relationship, you might think there are 2 people in the room. There aren't. There are 4. There's your conscious personality, there's your partner's conscious personality, and then there's your shadow, the disowned self, and your partner's shadow. 4 entities, not 2, all interacting simultaneously, mostly outside of anyone's awareness. Think about what that means for a second. When you feel a pull towards someone that you can't explain, a pull that has nothing to do with their kindness, their stability, the things you'd actually list if someone asked you why you love them, what's actually happening, according to Jung, is that your shadow has recognized their shadow, or has recognized someone capable of embodying what your shadow is holding. 2 unconscious systems finding each other underneath 2 conscious personalities that think they're the ones making the decision. That reframes everything for me. It's not that you have bad taste or bad luck, or that you keep failing to spot red flags everyone else can see. It's that a part of you, a part you don't have conscious access to, is looking for a very specific kind of mirror, and it is remarkably, almost frighteningly good at finding it. The person who wrote to me about doing all the work, therapy, boundaries, journaling, and still ending up with another narcissist, she wasn't failing. She was doing conscious work while an unconscious mechanism kept operating exactly the way it always had. Because conscious effort alone doesn't reach it. You can't out-strategize your shadow, you can only see it. There's a piece of academic research that backs this up in a way I didn't expect to find. A 2014 paper in the Journal of Analytical Psychology by Elizabeth Awen Nelson and Anthony Del Medico examines what they call shadow vows, unconscious agreements couples make from their disowned sides, using Jung's quaternary model to map how partners relate not just to each other's conscious selves, but to each other's shadows simultaneously. This isn't pop psychology. This is peer-reviewed clinical work building directly on the framework, taking it seriously as something observable in actual therapy rooms, not just theory on a page. And I want to pause here because I think this is exactly the point where people usually push back, and I understand why. Someone said to me once, a very smart, very skeptical friend, that all of this shadow and archetype language is basically unfalsifiable. You can't measure it in a lab. Attachment theory and behavioral conditioning already explain partner choice with actual empirical evidence, so why do we need the mystical version at all? Here's what I'd say to that, and it's not a dismissal because it's a fair question. Modern neuroscience is converging on something remarkably close to what Jung described almost a century ago. Predictive processing models of the brain show that we don't perceive the world neutrally. We generate internal models based on early experience and then project those models onto what we encounter, including onto other people. The amygdala-hippocampal striatal circuit processes relational templates formed in childhood, which is functionally a neurological substrate for exactly what Jung called shadow projection. And repetition compulsion, a concept Freud described back in 1920, confirmed today in neuroimaging studies of implicit emotional memory, describes precisely the mechanism Jung attributed to unresolved shadow material. Attachment theory doesn't contradict Jung. It explains the developmental origin of the content that later gets projected. They're not competing theories. One tells you where the wound formed. The other tells you how the wound keeps finding its way back into the room. And I want to say something else clearly because I promised at the start I wasn't going to let this collapse into either extreme. This is not victim blaming dressed up in old European psychiatry language. Jung was explicit. Projection is universal and involuntary. It is not a moral failure. Recognizing that your psyche participates in choosing a partner is not the same as saying the abuse you experienced was deserved. Guggenbühl-Craig and Sanford both insist that becoming aware of your own projections is an act of power being returned to you, not an act of self-blame. There is a real difference between you caused this and you now have access to the thing that can change the pattern. The first sentence is cruel and false. The second sentence is the only honest door out. John Sanford, a Jungian analyst who is also an Episcopal priest, wrote about this using a phrase I think about constantly. He called it the invisible partner. He argued that in every romantic relationship, we're not actually falling in love with a person, we're falling in love with our own inner image, what Jung called the anima or animus, projected onto that person like a slide onto a screen. The repeated relationship failures so many people describe aren't random. They're the same invisible partner, over and over, wearing different faces, because the inner image hasn't changed even though the outer person has. I think about the woman whose message started all of this. Maybe I'm not actually an empath. Maybe I'm just codependent. Here's what I'd say to her now, after sitting with all of this for longer than I expected to. That question itself, the willingness to ask it, is the exact moment the pattern starts to lose its grip, because the pattern survives on not being looked at. It needs you to keep calling it something else. Empathy, bad luck, a curse. The moment you're willing to ask, what if the common denominator in every failed relationship is something in me I haven't looked at? You've already done the one thing repetition compulsion cannot survive. You've made it conscious. I told you about a caretaking pattern earlier, someone who managed her mother's emotions as a child and then spent her 20s and 30s with a string of controlling, emotionally unavailable men. I want to finish that story now, because I think it's the clearest example I've found of what actually breaks the cycle. In Jungian therapy, she came to recognize that she'd repressed her own capacity for assertiveness and anger, because as a child, expressing anger meant losing her mother's conditional love. That anger didn't disappear. It became shadow. And she kept unconsciously projecting her own disowned power onto partners who expressed it back to her in a distorted, controlling form, because that was the only shape in which she recognized power at all. What changed wasn't a better filter for red flags. It wasn't a stricter checklist on the first date. What changed was that she started reclaiming the thing she'd exiled. She learned to say no. She learned to feel her own anger without apologizing for it. She learned to set a boundary and let the silence after it sit there without rushing to fix it, and she said something I haven't been able to forget. I stopped looking for someone to be strong for me because I finally became strong for myself. The kind of man I used to find exciting just seems exhausting now. That's the whole mechanism, right there, in one sentence. Not a new set of standards, a new relationship with her own shadow. Once she stopped needing someone else to carry her disowned power, the magnetic pull toward men who carried it in a controlling, distorted way simply stopped generating charge. The projection had nothing left to attach to. I keep thinking about the question I started with. Why do we keep choosing wrong? And I realize now that question itself is slightly off, and correcting it is the whole point of everything I've just told you. It's not that we choose wrong, it's that something in us chooses exactly right, according to a logic we've never been taught to see. The psyche isn't malfunctioning when it draws you towards someone who will force a confrontation with your shadow. It's doing precisely what it's built to do, seeking wholeness, even through means that look, from the outside, like self-sabotage. I don't think that makes the pain of those relationships smaller. I want to be honest about that. Understanding the mechanism didn't make my divorce hurt less at the time. What it did was stop me from telling myself a story about being cursed or broken or simply unlucky in love. Stories that leave you completely powerless because you can't fix bad luck. What you can do is meet the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime refusing to look at. That's not a comfortable assignment, I won't pretend it is, but it's the only version of this that actually leads somewhere different than where you've already been 3 or 4 times before. If you've made it this far, I have to ask you something, because this is exactly the kind of work I wish someone had handed me 15 years ago instead of letting me find it by accident at 2 a.m. after a divorce nearly broke something in me. What I do here, reading these old, dense, difficult texts so I can bring them back to people who are living through exactly what they describe, that only keeps happening because people who find value in it choose to support it directly. If something in this video actually landed for you, if it named something you felt but never had words for, consider leaving a super thanks. It's not about the amount. It's about telling me this work matters enough to keep doing, because there is a lot more Jung left, and I intend to keep going through all of it. You watching this and choosing to support it isn't passive. You're part of how these ideas stay alive, in a world that mostly wants 3-step listicles instead of the real difficult text. So let me ask you honestly, the way I'd ask a friend across the table, not a camera, do you recognize the pattern I've described? Have you noticed the same shape showing up in different people across your life? I'm not asking so you can perform an answer for me in the comments. I'm asking because naming it out loud, even to strangers, is part of how it loses its grip on you. Tell me what the pattern looked like for you. Tell me when you first suspected it wasn't bad luck. I read every one of these, and I mean that literally, not as a line I say at the end of a video. Sit with that for a moment before you go. Not who wronged me, a harder question. What have I been avoiding looking at in myself, and what does it cost me to keep looking away?